So, let me back this up a little bit. So we were talking earlier about ownership and accountability.
Okay.
So what do you think? I guess a couple things. One, what drives it? Do you have it? And why is it important?
Okay. So I think you have to have a workplace that actually takes on the accountability to actually have a significant amount of ownership in it. You have to have a culture that they have your buy-in, that you feel a part of something, that you're not just there running your 9 to 5 job and you're going home, right? When you actually have ownership in that company, I mean, you're gonna feel accountable for the decisions you make, and you're also gonna make a lot more. You're gonna have a lot more detail in your decisions, and a lot more planning and thoughtfulness for it.
Ownership, you mean like stocks and stock options, 401ks, or what do you mean?
No, like your personal investment,
Oh, okay.
self-investment, your time, your effort into that company. So I think once you can get ownership in a company, as far as that, I think you see buy-in with your team and a lot of progress that goes into that. But one of the hardest things to do is to get that to actually happen. A lot of companies, they don't really drive that ownership, right? Like they just go through the motions. And with accountability, makes mistakes or it isn't my fault. When you don't have that accountability, you're really not taking on that full ownership. Look, everybody makes mistakes, but the problem with a lot of people is they're not willing to accept those mistakes. They're not willing to speak up in front of a room and say, look, I screwed up. And this is what happened. We're going to learn from it. We're going to move on and make sure that doesn't happen again. And you don't always see that all the time. And I think that's a thing that a challenge for anybody growing into a leader or trying to develop their leadership skills, trying to motivate their team to actually to develop those skills and be open about that ownership.
So how does a leader build that into their culture? How do they instill ownership? I mean, is there something they do or don't do you think?
I think it's with like their boss or who they're working with, right? I mean, really putting trust and depending on them, and I mean asking for that ownership. But I mean, it has to start with a conversation about expectations, and I think a lot of industries, a lot of bosses don't even do that. So how can you know of what your management expects of you or to take lead and ownership of an operation when someone's not even conveyed to you what they actually want to do? So, but like, not a lot of people convey their expectations. So how can you have someone to even take ownership or be accountable for something if you haven't even conveyed really what their responsibilities are, what their job tasks are? And I mean, you can't hold someone accountable if they don't even know what the hell they're supposed to actually be doing.
Yeah.
Which is a huge problem, I think, in a lot of industries. But I mean, people, like I said, the 9 to 5, they just assume they go out there, check this box, checks this box. I think I'm doing my job correctly. Till you have those discussions, you really don't know.
The Navy, in its infinite wisdom, I thought did a very well. The Navy, not in general, but just the culture of naval aviation. You know, you look at the airplanes on the wall here. It's a $40 million jet. And when a young airman checks into the squadron, they make him what's called a plane captain. He's the guy who's last and finally responsible for the safety of flight of that airplane. 18 years old. You know, he's the youngest kid, the most inexperienced person in the unit. And you know what they do? They write his name on the side of the landing gear door. And it says, you know, this airplane, plane captain, airman, John Q, grab a sandwich. You know, and he's the guy. And just that builds, instills his pride. And like exactly what you said, his expectations are clearly defined, clearly spelled out, and his measure of success is tangible. And he can see that what he does and how it affects the operation of the entire squadron.
Names on it, and everybody knows that.
And he's proud, and he takes responsibility for it. And you can walk up to a young kid and ask him how the airplane is, and he can tell you exactly what's missing, what's right, what's wrong, and what's ready to go, and what needs to be done to get that airplane ready to go.
Well, and he's emotionally invested.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
It. I mean, it's more than just a job at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're right. I think ownership is a critical component, and I think in different organizations, a lot of bosses take away that ownership by always trying to tell you how to solve problems. And that goes back to our technical expertise discussion.
Instead of supporting you in decisions for
Yes.
you and your team to make to execute that job or
Yeah.
that plan.
I know we both saw some leaders in different, when we were working in different organizations, where the leaders were very good at asking their people for the recommended solutions, challenging them sometimes with, hey, have you thought about this or have you thought about that? But then once they've gotten past that, they'll say, okay, I like what you've done. Proceed with the way you want to do it. And they instill that sense of trust and ownership. Other leaders we've seen have said,
polar opposite. They've
exact-
already made a decision before you've even talked to them about
Yeah.
your solution.
Yeah, and you know it too, right? When
Yeah.
they're asking you.
And that's trying to be a good employee, right? I never call with a problem. I might state the problem, but I've always called with 3 solutions, right?
Mhm.
And said, this is the route that I want to go.
Mhm.
But I went from a boss that literally I would state the issue and what I was going to do, and they wouldn't even listen. They'd already be, this is where we're going.
Yeah.
To someone that asks, well, what do you want to do? Why is that? All right. I mean, makes you kind of stop because you're just not used to it. And
Yeah.
after starting to work with someone like that, I mean, the confidence that you get, it spreads to the people you're working with
Yeah,
on that crew, and it's immense.
It's like you said before, it's contagious.
Contagious, yes.
Absolutely, and it just works its way down. I learned something. A leadership principle very early on, and that was that a unit or an organization will take on the personality of its leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So if that personality is trusting and accepting and empowering, then it will spread throughout the entire organization. If that leader is micromanaging,
Anxious, quick to anger, quick to
lacks
respond.
confidence in his people, that spreads as well, and you will see the overall performance of the organization reflect that personality of the head of the organization. It's an amazing psychological phenomenon.
And how quick can you see that change, say going from one to the other?
It doesn't take long.
Pretty significant.
Yeah, and if you got a real strong personality, it'll happen even faster.
Mm-hmm.
If I can give you an example of that phenomenon, believe it or not, I tend to be a little bit sarcastic.
News to me.
Yeah. So I started leading my squadron with a very sarcastic tone. And so I would say things that were sarcastic and behave somewhat sarcastically, and I didn't think anything of it because it's who I am, who I was. Well, I am. Yeah, I probably still am. And so, but I was watching my people and talking with my people, and I started to observe my mannerisms in their behaviors. And that lesson that I'd learned several years prior clicked, and I went, oh my gosh, I need to really pay attention to what I'm doing. And I literally had to consciously stop being sarcastic in my job and in my work. Now I was still sarcastic off duty with my, hanging around at the bar or doing whatever, but you can't be sarcastic as a leader. You can't. It's not effective whatsoever. But seeing that happen, watching my personality start to kind of filter down to everybody else, was somewhat humbling to realize that there's something, you just can't control that. And so, yeah, but I also, part of my demeanor is I do trust people. And I do I set my expectations, and I do expect them to provide me solutions and give me, their ideas.
Well, if you're going to give someone that support, right,
Mhm.
you expect them to bring you that in return, right?
Exactly. And so I would give them the responsibility, and I would expect results, and they would produce, and we all learned to trust each other that way. And I stopped being sarcastic, and we had a much better, relationship after that with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So
So, and I noticed like the reflecting on site. Like, so we used to always joke around and we used to say, "What's up, Han?"
Mhm.
Just when we were walking. And I mean, think about just how contagious even
Yeah.
certain sayings you hear,
Mhm.
on a flight deck or, walking around a well site or whatever, and how that reflects over someone. Like I noticed.
yeah, I remember you,
What?
10 fur.
10 fur. Yeah.
Remember that 10
yeah,
fur?
Yeah.
You
But I
ever
mean,
think-
that's
you
an
used to
example.
say 10 fur, and we walked around the pad, and everybody you talked to when we walked around the pad said back to you at some point 10 fur.
Yeah.
And you started that
Mm-hmm.
as the leader of that group, and that's a small example, but it just shows you how powerful.
That's just vocal though,
Yeah.
right? Just think about mannerisms
Oh,
or
yeah,
the
yeah.
worst one's attitude, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because it can flip-flop either way, and it only takes one person that's kind of considered
Yeah.
a leader to really affect the group.
That's right.
So.
And that's why, I think the resonating theme that we'll always hit on is how important integrity is.
Mhm.
Because if you, the leader, don't have integrity, it will be reflected in everything everybody around you. That will just, and you can't stop it. So you've got to have integrity.
Well, and that's with that ownership, right? Because if you let that ownership slide once, or you let something pass, I mean, that integrity.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're reflecting even just your mannerisms and your sayings to your team,
Yeah.
well, if you're letting that slide, I mean, what else is going to happen?
Oh, absolutely.
And people, you think, oh, someone doesn't notice or that doesn't
Mhm.
really show. We're just going to let it happen that once. But you let it
Yeah.
happen that once.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a landslide, right? Snowball effect.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I got to stop saying absolutely. It's my favorite word, I think.
Absolutely.
But that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. Well, ownership
Anyways.
and accountability.
Yep. That's my dog. That's Coda. She's a good German Shepherd, but she's in the way right now.
Sounds like it's time for a break.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Dinner
appreciate you,
time.
Sean. It's good talking. Let's go eat some steak, huh?
Hell yeah.
All right.